My name is Henning Nielsen, and I've been given the great chance or job to introduce the next speaker. What we know makes the boat go faster from 40 years of research. And before we go into this talk, I would like to say a few words about this great man, Niels Secher, who was supposed to be here today and do a talk about his research. But what came across was that he yesterday received the Danish Nobel Prize, or so to say, a prize for his lifelong career in research. And much of his research is in rowing physiology. So I needed to mention that because it's a great honor just for rowing physiology, but also the whole community about exercise physiology in that respect. Okay. Oh, there's a little bottle here. So to build up to Stephen, rowing times improve over time. And that is both for females and males, and it's basically for every boat type. And this is a slide from Niels Secher's book, as you may all know, and you can buy it still. And one of the fundamental factors for improving performance, you just need a good head and some good genes. And one of the extremely well capacities, or big capacities in physiology, Per-Olof Ålstrand, one of you may know him, he's once said, the most important thing an inspiring athlete can do is to choose the right parents. Choose your genes. It may be simple, and maybe it's much more complex than that. So I'll just give the floor to Stephen, who is the sort of designer of this great scheme here in rowing performance. The floor is yours.
Yes, thanks. It's an honor to be here. I'm the reserve. You know, I don't know if any of you have ever been the reserve that suddenly gets called in, and this is the second time it's happened. One time it was for Bengt Saltine, and this time it's for Niels Secher. So if you're going to be the reserve, it's a pretty big honor to be the reserve for guys like that. I want to see if my presentation, yeah. 40 years wasn't enough for me, so I'm going to talk about 150 years of rowing faster. Because it turned out a few years ago, now it's almost 10, I found out there were two sources of data that actually stretched 150 years. They were objective data on rowing velocity. One was Oxford-Cambridge. They started a while, but they took a little while to decide what the standard distance would be. But since then it's been standard, now you have wind and waves, but there is a clear regression line there within the noise that says the boats have gotten faster. And it's pretty darn linear. And then we have source, the championship single for men. And again, there's noise. The noises seem to tighten up in the last 30, 40 years. Less noise, perhaps choice of courses and so forth. But again, a very clear progression in velocity. And so the question is, over this time span, what are the factors that have contributed? And that's what we're going to play with a little bit now. And then perhaps it'll lead to some questions about where is the room for future improvement. So about a 25 to 30% increase over 150 years. This is what we're going to try to play with or look at. And then maybe we'll see something about this, future improvements. So I'm going to do a very simple version of the energy balance model. If we want to row faster, you have to either find a way to increase propulsive power, or you have to decrease power losses. It's that simple. Okay? If we can do either or both, boat will go faster. On this side, we can say, well, power is a function of the metabolic capacity, aerobic capacity. Can we improve that? Can we improve anaerobic capacity? And then I'll separate out the third, can we improve maximal strength? Anaerobic capacity and maximal strength are obviously related, but for our purposes, I'm going to separate them out. All right, how do we do that? Well, on one side, over such a long time span, it may just be a function of just getting bigger. Humans have grown, or nutrition has allowed them to achieve a bigger percentage of their genetic potential. We'll look at that. And then, of course, training has the potential to increase this. So we're going to look at that side. And then power losses, we're going to look at drag forces on the boat, the oar blade interaction with the water and how that might be influencing speed, and then finally technical efficiency, which is kind of a big bag of different components. So let's start with this side and start here. There's some evolutionary constraints. I like sports. For me, I like a lot of sports. I look at them and you create the conditions, and then you sit back and you see what happens in terms of what characteristics tend to aggregate and be concentrated around that sport. And we know, just walking around in the room, that there is some aggregation. Some of you former rowers, you tend to be, this is the tallest audience I ever go to, is the rowing audience, for example. The race duration is a constraint. It's a weight-supported activity. That's a constraint. That has some impact on what will happen. The oar geometry dictates a relatively low cycle frequency. If we compare with running at 180 strides per minute, with cycling at 100 and so forth. So that's a constraint that changes things. And then the high water resistance causes a very pulsatile movement, and that is a constraint. So these things will impact how the sport attracts athletes and the techniques that are developed. What's the selection pressure? Well, we know height, arm length, those are advantages. There's a high selection pressure for absolute aerobic capacity. When we look at rowers, we're not so interested in VO2 per kg. We're interested in liters per minute. Whereas if we're looking at a climber in the Tour de France, totally different way of evaluating performance capacity. And then seems to be, in the endurance spectrum, a much greater selection pressure for strength and anaerobic capacity than we might see in some of the other endurance events that I'm interested in. All right, let's start here. These were champion rowers. This was Ned Hanlon from Canada, 1880. We know how big he was, 173 centimeters tall, 71 kilos. Great rower. Champion of the day. The Bigland brothers from 1865. Now we're guessing, but pretty good guess is they were around 180 centimeters, 75 to 80 kilos. Indisputable champions of the day. Ward brothers, same deal. So this gives us a little bit of an idea of what was gold medal standard anthropometry then. Now, for several reasons, as a population, particularly in Europe, Western population, nutrition and so forth has led to what we call secular growth. The average height of the population, the average body mass of the population, without thinking about fat, it's gotten higher. And at a rate of about 1 to 3 centimeters per decade over time. So for example, this is data from the Dutch 21-year-olds. This is the 97th percentile for height. That is, this is the group you recruit from, that upper end. Well, that height has gone from, in 1965, 190 was the top end. Now it's this was up from 2000, it was up to 196 or 7. That's a difference. That's a considerable difference. And obviously that means that the recruiting base for these types of athletes that go on to win gold medals, they have changed. So, for example, this is the Oxford crew from 2005, average height 197, average body weight 98 kilos. Think back to Ned Hanlon and the Bigland brothers, pretty big difference. In fact, if we take old Ned and put him here, he's now the coxswain. Now, if we take Ned Hanlon, typical male of that era, and scale him up in an absolutely representative way, so that he's the same size as our modern athlete, everything doesn't change linearly. There are some scaling issues. So VO2 max, the aerobic capacity, doesn't scale up linearly with that increase in body size. It has to do with some scaling issues related to cross-sectional area, for example, of the aorta versus the volume that increases with a linear change. So the classic scaling approach will tell us that strength in VO2 max will increase in proportion to mass to the 2/3. All right? Now, there's dispute on this. Some say, no, it has to do with fractal issues. It's more related to mass to the 3/4. So we agree that it's not linear, but we disagree on what the coefficient should be. Now, Niels Secker came in and took a stand on this, did some research with 117 Danish rowers back in 2001, and they found that when you used mass to the 0.73, that the body mass was eliminated, it was neutralized. So they suggested it was more in that direction, closer to 0.75 or 0.75, okay? For us, the key issue is that there is a cost to getting bigger. It's not just a benefit. We can measure a lot of parameters now that we couldn't measure 150 years ago. Just as a little historical aside, you know, ergometers have existed for 150 years. Quite interesting. 1871 is the picture there from W.B. Curtis, a rowing machine. The one in picture 2 probably was on the Titanic, among many other ships of the day. I believe that may be the Yale boathouse in number 3. And then we get to ergometers that begin to be able to actually measure work rate. The Yessing ergometer from the late 60s, 70s. So many of you are familiar with, I'm sure, and have used. So the ability to simulate rowing and at the same time actually measure work rates, that's had a pretty big evolution, and it's kind of been important in our understanding of the demands of the sport. Now, here's an early study. This was the Yale Championship crew, 1924. We know some things about them from the data. 185, 82 kilos. In other words, right very much in between in terms of modern rowing. Too big to be lightweights and way too small to be competitive heavyweights. But they were absolute champions of the day. A dominant team. So we know a little bit about them. This was published in 25. Already then, they were thinking this energy balance model, looking at the issue of what is, they did boat pulling measurements. They wanted to see how does the work demand increase with increased boat velocity. They were measuring metabolic expenditure. But they were unfortunately influenced by a pervasive idea of the day that the VO2 max for humans at that time, they said 4 liters per minute is max. They didn't even believe it could go above that, so they didn't even bother to measure it. They only measured up to a point and then they stopped, and they just said 4 liters is max. That was almost certainly wrong. And that caused them to make some calculation errors in their relative estimation of the anaerobic and the aerobic contribution. But they were on their way to something that we recognize in the way we think today, in terms of what is the cost, the metabolic cost of a certain velocity, and then what's the anaerobic and aerobic contribution, and how's that going to influence our training emphasis. Secker also showed that, yes, VO2 max is a pretty good predictor of performance. The average VO2 max of the boat correlated quite well with placement in an international regatta. Now, I'm not sure where he got all those VO2 max values for all those different countries, but this is what's published in Physiology of Sports. This is a wonderful picture because it's 2 rowers themselves that are studying themselves. They came to the conclusion that about 6.1 to 6.4 liters per minute for males was typical of championship level, and that hasn't changed very much, as we will show. And I need to also say that I apologize for something. For every female sports scientist and coach here, this is a very male-centric talk, but it's because the data, unfortunately, is on males. We have a historical database on males that we just don't have for females. So very much the physiology is the physiology. It's applicable, but when I use specific numbers like 6.5 liters, that's not applicable. And you need to arrest me on that and ask me those questions. For example, I would say for women it would be more like 4.7. 4.8 would be a relative comparison. Roger Jackson went on to have the Roger Jackson Center for Health and Wellness named after him up in Canada, and we know the history of Niels Secco. So this was a smart boat. Okay, so what do we know historically? There's a lot of holes in our information, but we have some reasonable guesses as far as an aerobic capacity increase. All the yellow dots are real data. That's published data that we have over the last 40 years, suggesting in my head, yeah, some increase from the 60s up to maybe the 80s, 90s, but as far as I can tell, it's flattening out in terms of aerobic capacity. I don't see the data suggesting that these teams are continuing to climb in average VO2 max today. They're still going faster though. So, but we do have singular measurements, again for males, of 7 liters plus. Isolated, Olaf Tufte, we know from Norway, had 6.8 on the ergometer, actually 7.1 on a treadmill running uphill. And probably some of our modern guys, like beyond him, Drysdale, may be above that. I'm sure British rowers, you've measured some 7 liter plus guys. So that's where we're at. What about women? I've talked with people I know and said, have you measured a 5 liter athlete? A 5 liter female, 5 liter, that's kind of, and some say, yeah, right at 4.8, 4.9, 5 liters. So 5 liters for women, 7 liters per men seems to be kind of upper end. An average for boats for males is probably 6.4, 6.5 liters. That's a big VO2. These are big engines. And much bigger than they were 100 years ago. So that's part of the source of speed. Now, I work in Norway. We have a lot of good cross-country skiers. They have some big engines themselves, but they don't tend to weigh 95 kilos. They tend to weigh somewhere like 75 to 80 kilos. And when you look at a typical world class, if we can use that term, it's 6.5 liters, 76 kilos, about 85 mLs per kg. And then we have a few that are hitting 90. Well, what if we scale up to a rower that weighs 95 with the exact same power or VO2 max per scaled body mass? You're going to need a 7.5 liter athlete. How many have measured that? Okay, so the point is that scaling up, so far we haven't seen too many of those, a 95 kilo male that is still hitting 80 mLs per kg that seems to be pretty tough to achieve genetically and physiologically. It may have to do with it's part of the scaling and partly probably some issues related to arterial perfusion limitations and so forth. There are rumors of 7 3s and 4s, but this is upper end. Benjamin Levine has estimated that if you were to maximize every physiological component, theoretically you might see an 8 liter VO2 max. But even he says, but in reality, none of those, that's making some assumptions that are almost certainly not true. So I think we're reaching some upper limits now in terms of aerobic capacity. So, how much of performance improvement is just a function of getting bigger, both males and females? Heavyweights being heavier, taller than they used to be. Well, the way I tried to approach this was I said, well, let's look at a place where we got some pretty good control. I looked at Lucerne over 3 years, 3 boat types in the first 3 places, and averaged velocities, and then said, what's the difference between the best lightweights in the world under ideal conditions and the best heavyweights under ideal conditions? For men, it was 2% in velocity. For women, it was 4%. So That 20 kilo difference in body weight, 25 kilo, the net effect for men is only about 2%. There's a significant cost to the increase in mass. We know that, you know that, but that's the numbers. Why is it bigger for females? That we'll have to see. It may be that number will shrink with greater recruitment and so forth. Training. What about the effect of training? How has training evolved? Well, this is Archibald McLaren. This is perhaps one of the very first books on training theory. It's from 1866, right here in London town area. Now, what was state-of-the-art training then? State-of-the-art. Rise at 7 a.m., immediately get out of bed, run 100 to 200 yards as fast as possible. Then, wait till about 5:30 in the afternoon, go down to the river, row up to the starting post and back, and go home. Reckoning a half an hour in rowing, 2.5 an hour from the starting point, and a quarter of an hour in the morning for the all-out run, 1.25 hours. Do that 3 times a week. That was state-of-the-art by Archibald McLaren. Okay, today. Well, this is 1996. This was the rowing sessions for the U.S. team. This was the women. 3 sessions a day at their peak. I think this was Hartmut Buschbacherson that was their coach at the time. So they were hitting 30+ hours a week. Compare that with the 3 hours that Archibald was recommending. So you've got a pretty big change. 1 day. Huh? 1 day. Well, yeah, 3 hours in a week versus 30 hours in a week. So a 10-fold increase in training loads at maximum loads that we've seen over this span. Now, if we put some more numbers to it, this is some work we did with Norwegian medalists over a 30-year time span. We wanted to see what had changed. We had their VO2 max, we had their training hours per year, and we saw a big change from the 70s to the 80s in the way they train. They trained somewhat more, but they also distributed their training differently, and I'll get to that. VO2 max tended to make a nice jump from the 70s to the 80s. Annual training loads went up to around 1,000 hours. And they seem to be about there now, 1,000, 1,100 hours. Now there's variation here, so you say, I've got a champion that's only at 900, so I'm with you. But we're in that area now, 1,000 hours plus. And there's really no difference between winter and summer now. They train at pretty high loads, pretty constantly. And when we looked at the distribution, the intensity distribution, the big change that happened from the 70s to the 80s, which was in parallel with a recognition that rowing was much more aerobic than anaerobic. There was a recognition that happened physiologically, and that seemed to be translated into a training difference that was more basic endurance training that happened. The high intensity load actually went down in that period. Now recall, VO2 max went up among the athletes. So it didn't have a negative effect on VO2 max, and if we can compare this as they were consistent with medal standard, then this seems to be probably a reasonable development that happened coincident with a better physiological understanding of the demands. This is training periodization of a 2-time gold medal winner. It's Tufte. We've gotten pretty good in Norway at really quantifying training in our athletes. We're using computerized training diaries, and we've had some people that have really been focused on it, including me, in terms of trying to understand training intensity distribution. So for example, here we can say with pretty good certainty that in the 2000-2008 season, 7-8 season for Tufte, where he won in 08, he had 1,041 training hours, 598 sessions. He rowed about 5,000 kilometers, which may be a little under the world-class average because they ski quite a bit and so forth in the winter in Norway. Hours per week, 22. Training sessions per week, about 12 and a half. So a lot of training and nothing new. for you guys. But if we look at that in the historical perspective, we understand that training has clearly evolved over time. If we look at intensity distribution, and this is an area I've worked a lot with, and this is a very reproducible description that we see with many of our, or essentially all of our Olympic champions and world champions in different sports, and we see it also in other countries, that the dominant intensity is low intensity. That is under the lactate threshold, under 2 millimolar blood lactate. They're accumulating a lot of hours at that intensity. And then they're doing some very limited but very important work at higher intensity zones. And they're not training too much in middle intensities. And so we've kind of used this term polarized intensity distribution. This is Tufte again. This is what we use, a 5 intensity zone model in Norway, so the colors are color coded. I'm not very smart, so I need colors. Green is low, dark green is a little bit higher, yellow is threshold, orange is zone 4, about 90%, red is around 93% up. Okay? So if we just take away the low intensity and look at the development for this rower for the high intensities, it looks something like this. That the distribution polarizes, we get more of the high intensity, the race pace component as we approach the season. Not a big surprise. Typical loads, 60-minute total load for zone 3 and 4, about 20-25 minutes in zone 5 when they do these sessions. Now, a little bit of medicine, a little bit, I come from kind of interested in the heart. Athletes' heart debate began already in the 1860s. Doctors in London were saying that rowing is bad for your heart, especially when you row more than 3 times a week. So they were saying the boat race was like cruelty to animals. And they warned that maximum effort for 20 minutes could lead to permanent injury. John Morgan, who was a rower, typical, you know, the rowers come back and defend their territory. He said, that's not true. And he looked at 251 former oarsmen with non-rowers, and he said the rowers lived on average 2 hours more. 2 hours, not 2 hours, 2 years. 2 years. So this debate has been there for a long time, the issue of the so-called athlete's heart. And the issue was myocardial hypertrophy. And I know you've heard a wonderful lecture yesterday that far exceeds anything I know on the topic, but I think in a historical perspective, it's interesting. This issue has been there. The big-hearted Italian rowers, I was influenced by this paper because I was doing my PhD at the time. The Italians have had in place national regulations regarding testing of competitive athletes, so they have to go through cardiological examinations. The good thing for epidemiology was it gave them a lot of data, a lot of echo data on hearts. So they looked at 947 elite athletes from different sports. They identified 16 that had ventricular wall thicknesses that exceeded the typical normal criteria for cardiomyopathy. Barely, I should add, but they did. And 15 of those 16 were either rowers or canoeists. So then the question is, was there something unique about the load imposed on the cardiovascular system with rowing, canoeing, perhaps related to the pressure at the catch and so forth? That was not reproduced in some British data that did some of the same things, so just so that's pointed out. But there was some suggestion that this combination of pressure and volume load on the heart may result in what looks like borderline cardiomyopathy. Now, the big difference between cardiomyopathy and an adaptive growth process is actually, is it adaptive? And the question, well, for one thing, if you compare an elite rower's heart with an untrained heart, there's no real difference in ventricular shape. The rower's heart is just bigger. And if you look at a rower's heart when they're at peak training and you measure end diastolic dimensions, and then you let them, then they detrain, just like detrain a biceps muscle, that heart muscle gets smaller. So that suggests that these are some adaptive, this is an adaptive process that happens. It's not pathological. What about strength? Well, back in '64, Ishiko put strain gauges on the oar. This was modern technology at the time to actually try to measure forces. 900 newtons was a force that we saw for modern rowers. No real difference. Already in the 60s, they were using the same number. Everybody knows, for you non-Newtonians, 900 newtons, in my head, that's 90 kilos pulled at the acceleration of gravity, if that helps, if you're a non-Newton guy or gal. Now, how strong do rowers need to be in order to execute the rowing stroke optimally? That was also a question that Seca asked. And he looked at the force velocity curve of muscle. He looked at, he made some estimations that at where the rower is on the force curve during a rowing situation, they should be able to, they typically generate about 40% of maximum force production capacity with each stroke. That was his estimate at the time. So his estimate was they should have a rowing strength, meaning a force production ability at the middle catch position or middle stroke position of 1,300 newtons. That should be an acceptable. And again, now we're talking males, heavyweights. Okay, did they? Well, then he looks at a group of rowers, measures isometric force in this laboratory simulation with the pillows under the butt and then the footboard and so forth. Isometric measures their peak force under this so-called rowing strength simulation. And he finds, well, for the first, they're at 2,000 newtons, so they're well in excess of this requirement that we think needs to be there. And he found no relationship between their performance level and that strength level at that time. So he said there's no correlation, number one, between how much force they can produce and what level they are among these rowers. And then number two, there was absolutely no correlation between the so-called rowing strength measurement and isolated measures such as leg extension, arm curls, and so forth. All right, I think this is still relevant today when we think about how do we train strength in the weight room. Is it transferring to the specific loading characteristics of a sliding, condition on the water? We're making assumptions that haven't really been tested even today regarding the applicability. How does that strength training transfer to the boat? Now, let's go over to the other side of the equation. We can decrease power losses, get more speed for a given metabolic demand or input. Hello? There we go. So we'll start with drag forces on the boat. This is the boat velocity oxygen demand relationship. We can extract that from the fact that the relationship between boat velocity and metabolic demand, it's a cubed relationship, so it's very much nonlinear. There is a very big price to pay for increasing velocity on the water. And already from the pulling studies, the boat pulling studies in the 1920s, we understand this and it has not changed. So if I take today's rowers, let's take the men's and women's single as a reference, and their boat velocity, gold medal standard, 5 meters per second for the men, that's a 640, for example. 4.5 meters per second for women, probably a 725 or so, 720. Now let's make them 10% faster. What would it take in terms of metabolic power? Pushing 10 liters per minute VO2 max to achieve that increase in velocity. In other words, pretty much outside the scope of our genetic potential as we understand it today. So there's not a lot of room. There's not 10% more speed on the power side as far as I can understand it with modern humans. So what about on the other side? The most important issue for boats, the most important source of drag or resistance that has to be overcome is skin surface drag. Now, normally that wouldn't be true in boats. Normally for a recreational boat out on the water, wave drag is a huge component of the total drag. But for rowing, it's only about 7%. And that's because the length to beam ratio for rowing shells is so high. So essentially, wave drag has a very minimal contribution. It is the skin drag or surface drag, the wetted surface area of the boat that is causing the resistance that we have to overcome. There is some air resistance, just like on a bicycle. Same rules apply in terms of cross-sectional area that is being pushed through the wind. So, you know, I guess we could wear some skin suits, but there's not a lot to be gained there. They've tried. That was the Dutch some years ago. So if we look at the boat itself, which is the source of skin drag and wave drag, the big revolution already occurred over 100 years ago. This was state of the art in 1830 on the Thames. Keeled boat, in-rigger, not a smooth surface. And already, around 1828, the outrigger was experimented with. The keelless hull came along around 1840. The thin skin application to a keelless frame, Taylor in 1855. So most of the revolution in the boat that allowed this half-size beam. The beam went in half, the length extended, and we have the modern boat. You wouldn't, if you had a wooden boat today and this wooden boat, you really wouldn't almost be able to see a difference from 150 years ago. So that revolution is already done. There's not a whole lot more to gain on shape. I know if you're Impacher here or you're Vespoli or something, you dare to differ, but it's tiny. It's small changes in the big scheme of things. Now, weight, there was a big revolution in the mass of the boat around the 70s when we went over to epoxy carbon fiber. In an 8, there was a 40-kilo reduction. That's a big change. It was worth some seconds in speed over 2,000. And in terms of boat weight, obviously, boat weight doesn't matter if fat weight of the rowers is growing, so you have to look at total mass of the boat plus rowers. And there's been several different equations that apply. This one's pretty straightforward. Basically, for every 6% reduction in total mass, you get a 1% improvement in speed, all other things being equal. Okay? So, in an 8, if you kick out the coxswain, it's worth a 1% increase in velocity, assuming you could hold the boat straight. Because an 8 with a heavyweight 8, I should add, with a 55-kilo coxswain, that's about a 6% drop, exactly, is to kick out the coxswain from a 900-plus kilo boat. Now, that would be relatively more useful in a pair, and we know the water taxi, you take away the coxswain, it goes faster, much faster. So we have good numbers on this, and that's been part of the evolution of rowing, is just to reduce total weight of the boat. But obviously, weight around the rower is exactly equivalent. If the rowers have excess body fat, that does slow down the boat. So it's a lot cheaper to eat some salads and reduce fat weight than it is to reduce the boat weight even more, probably. But it has to be, the capacity has to be maintained. And that's where we get into these issues of weight loss. So if you want to change boats radically, if we were going to do something really big, it would have to be way out of the box. And way out of the box has been done, but it's been done in kayak. We can just lift the whole boat out of the water, put it on wings. It works beautifully in kayak. Rasmussen from Norway developed this. He was a physics tinkerer that happened to be a national class kayaker, and he tested out these wings. And so there was a period where this hit the kayak scene by storm, and it was quickly outlawed, of course. But if you care to, you can go into hydrofoil kayak on the internet and find some wonderful YouTube videos where the paddler comes up and it's just like an airplane. Accelerate, accelerate, and the kayak lifts out of the water when there's enough velocity, and then suddenly he just, and the boat is flying and just zips by a K4. It's beautiful. It's illegal, but it just shows that that's what it would take if you wanted to really change the whole equation. Because you have to get that whole boat out of the water and change the whole hydrodynamic issue. That ain't going to happen unless FACSM makes some big changes in their mentality. This is what the wings look like. 2 wings, one in the stern, one in the bow. Okay, so not much to do with drag forces on the boat. What about the oar blade issue? Lots of things have happened there. This is part of that evolutionary issue that if you want to have that big excursion that gives you this work times distance equation that we need to accelerate the boat, you've got to be able to compress the body, the slide. But that wasn't always the case. Early days, there was no sliding seat. And in fact, when the first sliding seats came along, or the idea of sliding, it was recommended that the maximum slide excursion should be perhaps 6 inches. Anything more was just crazy and too hard technically. Things changed, and we know modern rowing is achieving full compression. This is what Babcock said in 1870 when they were coming along with the sliding seat. He says, yeah, it's really good. It's properly used. It's a big advantage, but it is just almost impractical because of the skill and unison that it requires. So they saw that the disadvantage of the sliding seat was suddenly there was a lot more moving parts and big masses that were moving up and down, and it was hard to control. Duh. But at the time, that was considered a limitation on the usefulness of this. Well, it's been overcome with training. Now, here's a picture. This is a London crew that won. Now, this artist didn't quite understand rowing. Look at that picture carefully. It's impossible. Where do they go? So it was totally wrong. The picture in the back was the London team, and it was reasonably correct, but the one in the front was just wrong. All right, then we get to the issue of the oar and its interaction with the water. All of you are familiar with that lovely 9 shape that is produced when the oar blade enters the water. It slips both positively and it slips negatively through the water. We always talk about grabbing hold of the lamppost or the catch, but that's not a reality. And the bottom line is this slippage, the negative slippage, is a loss of energy. We're moving water instead of the boat. What if we can reduce that slippage? What's the impact? And so it's possible to do some calculations and make some estimates of so-called oar efficiency, which is the relative ratio between boat movement and oar movement, put in simple terms, or slippage through the water. And all of you are familiar with this evolution. It's a function of material science. The oars of 100 years ago is one piece of wood. And that created limitations of how much you could generate a blade area and still have a construction that would tolerate the loads. It was already in the 1870s, there was a patent put on what was essentially the cleaver blade. It was patented in 1871. So often patents come before the material science allows the invention to be realized. Same thing happened with clap skates in skating, speed skating. The idea was patented 100 years before it was able to be realized. And then the realization resulted in a dramatic change in speed. Well, that revolution happened in rowing, 91. That was when I was just starting to row. So I had like a 1 year in makings, and then all of a sudden here came the cleaver blade. And I'm sure many of you others remember that transition. Some research demonstrated that it was more hydrodynamically efficient, meaning less slippage, less water movement, more boat movement for a given energy transfer. A source of speed improvement. Perhaps a source of rib fractures also, but that's part of the history. Today, you know, we're still tinkering. You know that there are competing companies, and I kind of like the Dreisig-Acker research system that they were using at the time. They were testing out various aspects of the war. These guys are great. They were tinkerers, you know. But things have modernized, and now they're using, you know, complex modeling to look at various features of the oar blade. I'm not sure how much better it's getting, but they're applying all the advantages of mathematical modeling to continue to play with those features. But again, it doesn't seem that there is a lot of potential for big changes in speed as a function of oar blade shape or details there. But I've been wrong before. So the effect of the oars, improved oars on boat speed, there's been some estimations made. Klezhnev used these instrumented boats, and he looked at 21 crews, and he estimated an 18% energy loss due to the moving water. So he said, hey, if we could cut that by 30 to 50%, we could gain 2 to 3% boat velocity. Now that was 15 years ago. Maybe we've achieved some of that already in the continued speed improvement with further details of the blade. So now we come to that last golden component, technique. Ergs don't float. So if you take technical efficiency, what are the components within this SAC technique? One of the components is this issue of boat velocity fluctuations. We know the boat does this. It's not a smooth, it's not kayak paddling. We've got these pulsatile surges that we would like to minimize. I remember when I was learning to row, I had the clever idea up in my head. I took a snorkel tube, taped it to the stern so that the water would come up, and then I'd have a little fountain coming out so that I could see how smoothly I was rowing by watching the fountain. Brilliant, huh? Didn't get me very far, but it was fun to look at for a while. So it's been an issue. It's an issue for every rower. We also have the issue of yaw, pitch, roll in the boat, obviously. Minimize that. And then finally, this issue of synchronization of force curves. Optimization, synchronization of force curves when you move to a multi-rower situation. What is the potential there? So, boat fluctuations, velocity fluctuations, the instantaneous power is really high because there's these big gaps where nothing's happening. So, if you take 500 watts, which is elite level power output for a heavyweight male, their peak powers may be 1,500 watts. So that's important to understand. And it costs more energy to have these fluctuations. Just like in a car, steady speed is more energy efficient than pushing your foot on the pedal and taking it off and on and so forth. But there's only so much we can do about it in rowing. One idea that came along was the sliding rigger. Idea again was patented in the 1870s. Everything's smart. Every good idea happened, it seemed, around 1870, and then it just took a while to actually realize it. So there were some smart folks in rowing around then. A functional model was built in the 50s. Volker Nolte and Impacher kind of developed it in the 80s. You guys, some of you are old enough to know the story. I've had to read about it, but it took the World Championships by storm. Colby won in 81. The top 5 finalists used a sliding rigger in 82, and it was quickly outlawed in 83. And they outlawed it, FACSM outlawed the sliding rigger based on high cost, meaning would not be available to all rowers. Would that be true today? Almost certainly not. Does FACSM want to revisit the idea? Almost certainly not. But that's the history. And it did reduce velocity fluctuations. It worked. And there was if you look at there is an estimated efficiency loss of 5% due to these fluctuations. If you can reduce that fluctuation, you get more speed. And that was pretty well convincingly demonstrated in that 1981-82 period. And the real effect of that we can mathematically estimate of 1% is probably bigger because it impacts technique. It makes it easier to do some other things technically. But that's hard to calculate. So if you just say that's an extra percent, then you're looking probably at least 2% velocity improvement. That's a lot of seconds over 2,000 meters. What about this issue? Is there much to do there? Bottom line, probably not. The yaw issue is very small. Pitch up and down is mostly a function of just the mass, the total mass of the boat. And then you have roll, which everyone works on as a rower every day of their life for as long as they row to minimize the roll. And typical measurements suggest that the good rowers are down at 0.3 to 2 degrees roll, not much. So how much can we gain there in terms of speed? Individual boats, have a lot to gain, but the best boats in the world, there's probably not a lot of room for speed improvements as a function of these issues. Finally, the force curve. What happens really when the blade goes into the water, the rower pulls hard, and the blade leaves the water? We see it enter, we see it leave, but what is the signature, the force curve in that period that the blade is engaged and the oar handle is engaged? Well, Ishiko did pretty much, he started the whole conversation in 71 by being able to instrument several boats, several rowers, puts them up here by name, and then shows these signatures. And just like a signature, he showed every one of them are different. So then the question becomes, okay, in an 8, should we accept that every signature is different and just try to get them in and out at the same time? And what happens in between is just what happens, and we add all up the force under the curve and assume that's going to make the boat go faster? Or should we be trying to entrain the athletes on one signature, on a pattern? And is it realistic to do that, to assume that we can do that? This is data from 95 from Wing and Woodburn. They looked at fatigue. What happens, what's the curve look like when you're fresh and you first start rowing? Then you row an intense piece, and towards the end of the piece, has the signature changed? The answer is very little. You see the dotted lines are the curve at a very fatigued point. The straight lines or the normal lines are when they're fresh. So the characteristics of the curve don't really change. The amplitude goes down a bit. So it seems to be a stable feature of the rower. Here's a study from 2002 from Hill. What happens to synchronization as the force increases? If you go from a steady state row to race pace, how does the signature change? At least this data suggests that perhaps the signature actually, or the rowers, synchronize better at higher forces than they do at lower forces. There's more degrees of freedom, you might say, at lower forces or lower intensities. And as intensity goes up, they almost get constrained in a little bit to a signature. Now, the reason I put this here is because even in the course of the time since I first started talking about this, so much has happened in terms of mobile technologies, shrinking down the instrumentation, making it available in boats and cost effective. So the question is what is the potential here for us to use these tools? Is it a source of confusion, or will it be a source of aggregation towards an optimal curve? I think this is really important. If you're a sports scientist in any setting, I talk about this issue in other settings, that our role as a sports science support to support the coach is always fundamentally to improve the communication between the coach and the athlete, meaning give them information that improves that dialogue and makes it more effective. So this is the big stage we're in now, is we have the ability to measure so much, so many different variables related to the kinematics and the kinetics of the stroke, of the rowing situation. But we got to be really careful that we just don't put too many cooks stirring the pot and lose focus. And that's going to be, I think that's where we are right now, is making sure that we decide, keeping it simple scientist, giving the coach, giving the athletes actionable information. But it's really fun because the tools are so accessible now. I can take an iPad, take a picture quick, and then I use an application to I can do some angles. I can immediately give feedback to the rowers. Here's your angle at the catch. Here's your angle at the finish. That wasn't available 15 years ago. So it's an exciting time. But we just have to be careful how we put it all together and what tools we choose and what numbers we choose to emphasize. Now, is there an optimal force curve? My feeling is probably for a single sculler, we could say there's probably some optimal for that individual athlete that is a function of their anthropometry, their fiber type composition, and so forth. Multiple variables will influence that curve. And there would be an optima that we would try to work around what's optimal in terms of the oar excursion and so forth. What about a team boat? There's where I get skeptical, is how much can we tweak and change the force curves of great motors to force them into some curve and move them away from maybe their anthropometric optima, their fiber composition optima. So that's going to be your challenge, is to decide what that happy balance is between the biomechanical and physiological constraints that they bring to the table versus what's best for the boat in terms of a potential to optimize. So this is a best guess of the relative contribution of these different factors I've talked about. And it's fuzzy, so you are forewarned. But I think, the increased physical dimensions, we can say 10% increase in boat velocity is just a function of scaling up the rowers. There's a cost there, so it's not as big a difference as we might expect otherwise. Training, huge effect, technically and physiologically, obviously. So it's difficult to put a number on that. And then we've got boat design issues. So much of that happened so long ago that it's already out of the equation. It was already, the revolution had already happened in 1860. Efficiency of the oar, significant. And then the sliding seat, evolved rowing technique, a big change. So am I pessimistic as to the potential for big changes in the future? Yeah, a little bit, because we're really starting to encroach upon some limitations here. I think that we're going to keep seeing faster rowers, but a 6-minute 2000 for a single sculler, Are we going to see that in the next 20 years? I'm not sure. That would require a tremendous change in this equation somewhere. Maybe you'll figure out where. Thanks. Questions? Everybody's exhausted, I guess.
Stephen, there's come a lot of dimensions on that one, but one of the things that I don't see on presentations such as yours are graphs that actually show maximum or optimized propulsive force graphs. I see peak force, I see all sorts of representations of the athlete's contribution in terms of their work ethic, but not ones that actually give optimal boat speed in terms of the leverage past their spoon, given the force that they're applying to the handle. Have you got any comments on that?
Well, I'm not a biomechanist, so I'm going to be careful of what I'm going to say on that.
You can duck out completely then, that's fine.
So I suspect a biomechanist should chime in. But I'm always on the physiological side, as I'm always leaning in the direction of how is the physiology impacting the signature.
After fascinating talk, but rowers are not only physiology and mechanics, they are for the brains, and
I disagree.
Tell me something about the psychology and the mind. Does it change, or have our behavior or attitude or our approach to the mind and the psychology of the rower has an influence on performance? Or are we the same as 1834?
It's an interesting question. I think I'm going to relate it to another group that there's been so much discussion about the African advantage in distance running, the Kenyan advantage in distance running. And there have been so many groups that have tried to go in and say, what explains the Kenyan dominance of distance running? Is it the body? Is it the mind? And there were theories related to the fact of how they grow up and that they tolerate pain better. That would be a perceptual issue. And every study that's been able to be done, they basically say, no, we can't see anything that suggests there's a difference in perceived exertion and those kinds of things that would be really attractive to theorize about. So if I just use that as an example, I'm not sure. I want to believe that those guys that rowed in 1850, they rowed the hell out of the boat. I mean, they gave it their all. But they didn't have the training. They didn't have the technical foundation, the training foundation. They didn't know as much about pacing issues. So I don't know how you pull apart all of those issues from the brain part. Does that make sense? You're just trying to challenge me, and you're trying to give the reserve guy a hard time, I know.
My question is regarding the comparison that you have done with cross-country skiers and rowers, where you said that cross-country skiers are around 85 milliliters per kilogram of body weight, and you compare with the heavyweight men. But it should be nice if you can compare with the lightweight men, because the weight of skiers is much closer to the lightweight than heavyweight. So on these sides, the lightweights, they reach the same level of cross-country skiers, or there is a margin to reach that level?
Kurt Jensen's not here, but I guess one of the best people to talk would be, since you have so many, or there's been so much data on lightweights, I don't know if you have any of that data in your head, but I suspect 80, 81s are not so uncommon for those guys. I haven't seen so much 85, 86, 87, 88, but absolute 80s I've seen. Is that consistent with your observations of the Danish data?
I think so.
Yeah. But we have to, there is this issue of supine versus standing and mobilization. You know, let's take Olaf Tufte, which we happen to have data on. even though he was specialized, trained for rowing, his VO2 max, his VO2 peak, let's say it more correctly, was actually lower on the ergometer than it was on a treadmill. Just throw it out there. So there may be some limitations associated with the supine position for the lightweight rower versus the lightweight skier.
Could that be a problem that we are not able to measure real VO2 max on the rowing condition because our devices are much worse than 10, 20 years ago?
Our devices
if you say
worse.
Tufte has a higher VO2 max on the treadmill, that could be you measure on the treadmill the exact value, and we have a problem with the timing constraints and breathing and so on, that our breast-to-breast devices have a real problem to get a real VO2 max because the VO2 max on the rowing ergometer of the rower is higher than that we are measuring.
Yeah, so there may be some methodological issues related to the entrainment. I know there's been theories about is maximum ventilation being limited in the rowing stroke, but the data it goes both directions. So I haven't been able to see anything convincing there. My only point is that I'm not sure we can directly equate that supine position or semi-supine position with the vertical position in terms of myocardial dynamics. They're all well trained. They're all incredibly well trained. Every time someone tries to pull me into a discussion of who are the best endurance athletes, I always just say that it is totally a function of the constraints and you know, the athlete and they're fitting that set of constraints. It's a question that doesn't make sense.
I'd be interested to know, in the light of what you said about peak force in the rowing stroke, if you think there's an ideal or an optimal relationship between peak force applied during the rowing stroke and the inherent maximal strength that a rower actually has, and how you might assess or measure this reliably and validly.
I don't know what that ratio is. I think the way you would know when you've got it is that they are able to execute the stroke with the technique that you want. I hear little discussions, and it's always the way I've thought too. Is I haven't talked enough about female rowers. Let's compare and contrast male and female rowers. If we talk about strength training, I think perhaps that is one area where the fundamental training concept might be different. As we would say that just genetically, anthropometrically, we're going to tend to have female rowers that will have a strength deficit in their upper body relative to their lower body, and that deficit should, if it's corrected or improved, will facilitate a more optimal stroke curve or first curve in rowing. So I don't know how it's like going back to ratios between hamstrings and quadriceps around the knee. You can play with those ratios, but in rowing, what the fundamental issue is, can they maintain those postures? Are they able to execute the stroke? Because there's nothing that says they ever come close to peak to maximum forces in the boat. Not even close. Just so we know. But after 200 strokes, there may be a fatigue that is now changing their stroke technique, and they are losing power. They're losing efficiency. And that's what we want to correct.
It was more the physiological implications I was thinking about than the mechanical.
Yeah, I'm still, again, I guess the bottom line for me is that maximum forces in the boat are not very close to maximum forces that are achievable. The limitation is still associated with energy production, with some exceptions, which may particularly be an athlete that has a deficit in their core stability, for example, that is not able to connect leg to back to arms, that there is a weak link that can fundamentally disturb the dynamic. And those links have to be corrected. And there is great potential for strength training there. But you're going to have some athletes that just don't need strength training. those ratios are appropriate. They have sufficient muscle mass. They have sufficient maximum strength. It's waste of time. I suspect those athletes are also present. We've seen it in speed skating, for example. Seen gold medalists at strength training was just, the only thing it did was get them sore. They went faster when they didn't do it. So I'm a fan of strength training, but it needs to have a clear goal with it. And we shouldn't think that it changes metabolic energy availability. It doesn't. You still have to, you have these limitations in terms of oxygen availability and anaerobic capacity.
If we do most of our strength training in the gym, then how do we know how strong is?
Yeah, you're asking the question that I'm asking too. I think we're all still dealing with this question is, number one, how much strength is necessary? Is it contributing to a change in the stroke, into the technical proficiency of the athlete? Is it transferring? You know, Seiler, if we go back to Niels, he was on to something, I guess is what we want to say, is that given the methodological constraints he had in 1970, he was trying to say something about isolated strength measurements or force measurements versus the complex integration in a multi-joint movement. Is the correlation there? The answer for him was no, it's not there. Now the question is, have we made a lot of progress on that question since 1970? And as far as I can tell, the answer is still no, we haven't really made so much progress. It's still a kind of an intractable problem so far. But so I challenge sports scientists here to kind of go back to what was a good question in 1970 for Dr. Seiler, because it's still a good question. So if Niels were here, that would, maybe I suspect he would be saying the same thing. So as the reserve, I can at least say that. Anything else? Other questions? Yeah, all done. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed.